Tanya was excited as she walked down the aisles of her local grocery store. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden light through the windows. She was 6 months pregnant, and despite her swollen belly, she felt a sense of calm as she pushed her shopping cart. Tanya had always enjoyed these little trips, the peaceful hum of the store, and the routine of picking out groceries for her family. As she reached for a jar of pasta sauce on a high shelf, she accidentally bumped into someone. She turned quickly, apologizing before even seeing who it was. When she looked up, Tanya saw the man was in a police uniform. He was tall, with a rough expression, and his eyes were cold. He seemed irritated by the bump, but Tanya didn't think much of it. People were often in a hurry at the store, and accidents happened. "I'm sorry," Tanya said with a friendly smile, hoping to smooth things over. The officer didn't smile back. Instead, he sneered at her. "Watch where you're going," he snapped, his voice harsh. Tanya was taken aback. She had apologized, yet the officer's tone felt aggressive, like he was blaming her for something that wasn't her fault. She stepped back slightly, not wanting to cause any more trouble, but he didn't let it go. "You people are always so careless," he muttered under his breath, so quietly that only she could hear. Tanya's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected to hear words like that from anyone, especially not a police officer. But she didn't want to make a scene. She took a deep breath and tried to ignore him, reaching back for the pasta sauce. But the officer wasn't finished. Without warning, the officer shoved her lightly. The push was enough to unbalance her. Tanya stumbled forward, her hand flying out to catch herself. She managed to stop herself from falling, but she could feel the shock running through her. She turned to him, her voice trembling now. "What's wrong with you?" "I didn't do anything." The officer didn't apologize. Instead, he sneered again, his face turning red with anger. "You should be more careful next time," he said, his eyes cold. Tanya stood there, frozen. She wanted to say something back, but the words wouldn't come. The officer then made a gesture as if to walk away, but before he turned his back on her, he kicked her in the side, a light but sharp blow. The action was quick, but Tanya felt it. She gasped, a mix of surprise and pain rising in her chest. Other people in the store were beginning to notice. A few of them had their phones out, recording the scene. Tanya's eyes stung with tears, not from physical pain, but from the humiliation of being treated like that in front of everyone. The officer walked away without a word, acting as if nothing had happened. Tanya slowly stood upright, her hand on her belly. She was shaken, but the baby seemed to be fine. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. But her heart was heavy with something else. Anger. No one should be treated like that. And she wasn't going to let this go. She didn't know what to do next, but she knew she couldn't let the officer's behavior go unnoticed. When Tanya got to the counter, she paid for her groceries, her hands trembling as she held the receipt. The last thing on her mind was finishing her shopping. The only thing she could think about now was what had just happened, and what she was going to do about it. After the incident at the store, Tanya could barely think straight. Her mind kept replaying the moment the officer shoved her, and the sudden kick that followed. The shock of it all left her feeling shaken, as if she had been hit harder than she realized. But above all, the thought that kept running through her mind was her baby. She made her way home slowly, holding her stomach. She kept reassuring herself, "The baby is fine. The baby is fine." But there was a small part of her that was worried, wondering if the stress or the shock might have affected the child she was carrying. The pain in her side was there, but it wasn't enough to make her panic. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of something being wrong. When she arrived home, Marcus was in the kitchen, his back turned as he chopped vegetables. His eyes lit up when he saw her, but then immediately turned to concern when he noticed her face. "Tanya, what happened?" "You look pale," Marcus said, his voice filled with worry as he put the knife down and rushed over to her. Tanya took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears. "I'm fine, Marcus," she whispered, though her voice wavered. "It's just Something happened at the store. Marcus looked at her, waiting for an explanation. Tanya knew she couldn't hide it from him. He had always been her rock, the person who knew when something was wrong without her even saying a word. There was this cop, Tanya started, her hand shaking as she held onto her stomach. He was rude to me. And then, he pushed me. I stumbled, and he kicked me. I don't know why, Marcus. Marcus's face turned red with anger. He stepped closer, gently placing his hands on her shoulders. What? A cop? He kicked you. His voice was a mix of disbelief and fury. Are you okay? Is the baby? I'm okay, Tanya said quickly, cutting him off. The baby is moving, but I'm worried, Marcus. What if I hurt the baby? What if something happens? Marcus immediately took Tanya's hands in his, looking at her with calm, reassuring eyes. We're going to the hospital, he said firmly. You're not going to go through this alone. Even though Tanya felt exhausted and overwhelmed, she appreciated how calm Marcus was in the moment. He always knew how to handle things, no matter how bad they seemed. They arrived at the hospital a short time later, Tanya walking slowly, leaning on Marcus for support. The nurse who greeted them could see the concern in their eyes and immediately took Tanya to a private room. Within moments, a doctor came in, ready to check on her and make sure everything was all right. Let's take a look, the doctor said with a gentle smile. How are you feeling? I'm okay, Tanya replied, her voice still shaky. But I was kicked, and I'm worried about the baby. The doctor nodded, performing an ultrasound to make sure everything was normal. Tanya held her breath as she watched the monitor. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor smiled. The baby looks healthy, the doctor said. No signs of distress. Everything is just fine. Tanya exhaled in relief, and Marcus squeezed her hand tightly. They both smiled, their worries lifting slightly, but they both knew something had to be done about what had happened at the store. Tanya might have been physically all right, but the emotional pain of being mistreated was harder to ignore. As they left the hospital, Marcus's mind was already racing with thoughts of what he could do. He wasn't going to let the officer's actions slide. He would make sure Tanya got the justice she deserved, whatever it took. The next morning, Tanya and Marcus woke up to the sound of birds outside their window. The bright sun had already started to shine, but there was no warmth in the air for Tanya. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the store. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. How could someone, especially a police officer, treat her like that? Marcus, on the other hand, had only one thing on his mind: making sure the officer faced the consequences. He knew he couldn't just let it go. Tanya deserved better, and so did the community. He had to stand up for what was right. After breakfast, Marcus told Tanya, I'm going to the police station. I'm filing a complaint. Tanya nodded, though she felt nervous. She wasn't sure what good it would do. The officer was a cop, and she didn't know how much power her complaint would have. But she trusted Marcus, and if he thought it was important, she knew it was. At the police station, Marcus walked up to the front desk, where a friendly officer smiled at him. How can I help you today? The officer asked. I'd like to file a complaint, Marcus said, his voice steady, about Officer Daniels. He attacked my wife at the grocery store yesterday, pushed her and kicked her. The officer's smile faded slightly. I see, he said. Let me get someone to help you. Soon, a senior officer appeared, looking at Marcus with a professional but somewhat uninterested expression. What's the problem? He asked, his tone flat. Marcus tried to stay calm, but his anger was starting to show. My wife was kicked by Officer Daniels, he repeated, his voice rising just a bit. He shouldn't be able to treat people like that. The senior officer listened for a moment, then gave a small nod. We'll look into it, he said quickly. We'll need you to fill out a report, but you should know that these things take time. There's a process. Marcus didn't like the way the officer was brushing him off. but he kept his cool. He knew that if he made a scene now, it would only make things worse. "I understand," he said, "but I want this to be taken seriously. This isn't just some minor thing. What he did was wrong." The officer looked at Marcus, then glanced down at the paperwork in front of him. "We'll see what we can do, but we've had complaints before about Officer Daniels. I can't promise anything." Marcus felt a wave of frustration wash over him. "I don't want promises. I want justice." The officer nodded again. "Please fill out the form, and we'll take it from there." Marcus did as he was told, filling out the complaint form while Tanya sat quietly in the waiting area, trying to remain calm. She wasn't sure how much good this complaint would do, but she knew Marcus wouldn't stop fighting for her. When they left the police station, neither of them felt any sense of closure. The whole process had felt cold and dismissive, but Marcus wasn't ready to give up. He had already started thinking about other ways to make sure Officer Daniels faced the consequences of his actions. As they walked out into the bright sunshine, Marcus turned to Tanya. "We're not done. Not by a long shot. We're going to make sure everyone knows what happened." Tanya smiled weakly, grateful for Marcus's determination. But deep down, she couldn't help but feel like she was up against something much bigger than just one man. Still, she knew that as long as they had each other, they would keep fighting for justice. And that thought gave her hope. After Marcus filed the complaint, he wasn't about to sit back and wait. He knew that if he didn't act fast, nothing would change. Tanya was still shaken by what happened, and while she was grateful for the support, she didn't want the officer's actions to be forgotten. Marcus, however, was determined to make sure the truth came to light. That evening, Marcus sat down at his computer and began typing. He wanted to share what had happened, to make sure people knew about Officer Daniels and what he had done. With a few clicks, he posted Tanya's story online. He shared the details of the incident at the store, including the video that some people had recorded of the officer shoving and kicking Tanya. The post also included the hospital visit, showing that Tanya was worried about the baby. He made sure to explain how the police station hadn't done much to help. The post didn't just stay within their circle of friends and family. It quickly went viral. People from all over began sharing the story, some expressing their anger at how the officer had treated Tanya. Others voiced their support, saying that something needed to be done about officers like Daniels who used their position to harm people. As the posts spread, people began reaching out to Marcus. Some offered words of encouragement, while others shared their own stories of bad experiences with law enforcement. There were even a few local news outlets that contacted him, wanting to interview him about what had happened. It felt overwhelming, but Marcus knew it was the right thing to do. The more people who knew about it, the more pressure the police department would face to take action. The next day, Marcus stood outside the police station with a sign that read, "Justice for Tanya." He wasn't alone. Many others had gathered to stand with him. Some of them were friends, others were strangers who had seen the story online. They chanted together, calling for accountability. "No justice, no peace," they shouted, as a group of local activists joined the crowd. Tanya watched from their home, feeling a mix of emotions. She was grateful for the support, but also overwhelmed by the attention. She never wanted her life to be public, but now, because of what had happened, they had no choice but to fight. She knew Marcus wouldn't stop until they saw change, and that made her feel stronger too. Days passed, and the protests continued to grow in size. Marcus was now speaking to news reporters, telling them what had happened to Tanya and how the police department had handled it. His voice was steady and filled with conviction, even though inside he felt exhausted. Tanya had always been his rock, and now it was his turn to be hers. The story had become more than just a personal issue. It was a movement. People from different communities came forward to support Tanya and Marcus. They shared their own stories of injustice, showing that this was not just one bad cop. It was a pattern, one that affected many people. The more voices that joined in, the harder it would be for the police to ignore. One evening, As Marcus scrolled through his phone, he saw a message that made his heart race. A reporter had just published an article listing Officer Daniels' history of complaints and incidents. It was a game changer. People began to ask how this officer had been allowed to continue serving, and the pressure was building. Tanya and Marcus knew this was just the beginning, but they felt a renewed sense of hope. Their fight was getting stronger. As the protests and online support for Tanya and Marcus continued to grow, the pressure on the police department started to mount. The case wasn't just about one officer anymore. It had become a symbol of the issues that had been ignored for far too long. The attention was overwhelming, but it was also giving Tanya and Marcus a sense of hope. They knew that they couldn't let this moment slip by without making real change. One afternoon, as Marcus was going through messages on his phone, he noticed a notification about a news article that had just been published. It was from a local reporter who had been investigating Officer Daniels' past. The headline read, "Officer Daniels' History of Complaints. What the police department didn't want you to know." Marcus clicked on the article, his heart racing. As he read through it, his eyes widened with shock. The article revealed that Daniels had been the subject of several complaints over the years. There were accusations of excessive force, verbal abuse, and even previous incidents involving people of color. Yet despite these complaints, he had remained on the force. Marcus couldn't believe what he was reading. This officer had a history, and no one had taken action. The reporter had even uncovered internal reports where Daniels had been reprimanded but never faced serious consequences. It was clear that the system had failed to hold him accountable for his actions. The article also included statements from other people who had come forward with similar stories about the officer, confirming that this wasn't just an isolated incident. Marcus felt a mixture of anger and disbelief. How had Officer Daniels been allowed to continue working as a police officer with all these complaints against him? But there was something else. The article was a turning point. It was no longer just Tanya's word against the officers. Now there was evidence of a pattern of misconduct, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. He immediately called Tanya to tell her the news. She was at home, reading through some of the supportive messages they had received from strangers. When she picked up the phone, Marcus didn't waste any time. "Tanya, you need to see this," he said, his voice filled with urgency. Tanya's heart skipped a beat. "What is it, Marcus?" "Remember how we were worried the police wouldn't do anything?" Marcus asked. "Well, it looks like someone's finally listening. There's a new article out, and it exposes everything about Officer Daniels. His past complaints, his history with abuse. It's all there." Tanya felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Finally, it wasn't just a single incident being brushed aside. Now they had proof that Officer Daniels wasn't just a bad apple. He was part of a larger problem. She could feel her anger start to shift into something more powerful. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure this kind of thing never happened again. The article quickly went viral, and soon more people were speaking out. Journalists began digging deeper into Officer Daniels' background, revealing more troubling details. Local activists took to the streets in even larger numbers, demanding that the police department take real action. The police station was under immense pressure. People were asking how they could have allowed someone with such a history to remain on the force. The story had taken on a life of its own. And now, the eyes of the entire city were focused on what the police department would do next. For Marcus and Tanya, it was a reminder that their fight was bigger than they had ever imagined, and they were just getting started. As the story of Tanya and Marcus continued to spread, so did the pressure on the police department. Officer Daniels was now at the center of a growing storm. His past behavior had been exposed, and people were demanding accountability. But for Marcus, the fight was far from over. He knew that exposing the officer's history wasn't enough. The real challenge would come when they took legal action. Marcus sat down one evening with Tanya, his eyes filled with determination. "We need to take this to court," he said, his voice strong. Tanya looked at him, unsure but willing to trust him. "You really think that will help?" "I have to try," Marcus replied. "We can't let him get away with this. Not after everything that's happened. The department needs to know they can't treat people like this and get away with it." Tanya nodded, understanding that Marcus wasn't going to stop until justice was done. She could see how much this meant to him. He wasn't just fighting for her anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been hurt by the system. Marcus wasted no time. He reached out to a lawyer named Rachel, a woman known for her passion for justice and her work in fighting against police misconduct. When they met, Rachel listened carefully as Marcus explained everything that had happened. The incident at the grocery store, the complaints about Officer Daniels, the lack of action from the police department. Rachel took a deep breath after hearing the whole story. "This is a strong case," she said. "We have evidence, and we have witnesses. The department's own records show that Officer Daniels has been a problem for a long time. We'll make sure they can't ignore this." Over the next few weeks, Rachel worked tirelessly on the case. She gathered the video footage from the grocery store, the statements from witnesses, and the article exposing Officer Daniels' past. The more they collected, the clearer it became that they had a solid case. The officer's actions were inexcusable, and it was time for him to face the consequences. The media coverage of the case only grew as they prepared for the trial. Tanya and Marcus were interviewed by reporters who wanted to know what they hoped to achieve. Tanya, though still shaken by the events, was firm in her message. "We just want justice," she said in one interview. "No one should have to go through what I did. We need to make sure this never happens again." But Tanya wasn't the only one speaking out. People from all over the community joined the cause, signing petitions and showing up to rallies. Marcus felt proud of the support they were receiving, but he knew the real work was yet to come. The trial would be the turning point. On the day the lawsuit was officially filed, Tanya and Marcus walked into the courthouse with their heads held high. They were no longer just a couple dealing with an awful incident. They were a symbol of the fight for fairness. The courtroom was packed with people who had followed the case, and the atmosphere was filled with anticipation. Rachel stood beside them, ready to present their case. As they sat down, Marcus took Tanya's hand. He could feel her nerves, but he also felt the strength in her. They had come so far, and they weren't about to give up now. The trial had begun, and for Marcus and Tanya, this was just the beginning of their fight for justice. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it together. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial began. Tanya and Marcus sat together, their hearts pounding in their chests. The journey had been long, filled with emotional ups and downs, but now they were finally facing the moment they had been fighting for. The case was no longer just about one officer. It had become about holding the system accountable. Marcus squeezed Tanya's hand as they listened to the opening statements. Rachel, their lawyer, spoke confidently, explaining the details of the case, the video footage from the grocery store, the numerous complaints against Officer Daniels, and the disturbing pattern of behavior that had been ignored by the police department. The evidence was clear, and Rachel made sure to highlight just how dangerous Officer Daniels' actions had been. She painted a picture of a man who had used his badge to mistreat people and who had done so without fear of consequences. Tanya sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. Her mind kept drifting to that day in the store, to the shock and pain she had felt when Officer Daniels had shoved and kicked her. She remembered how terrified she had been, not just for herself, but for her unborn baby. But now, with the evidence and support behind them, she felt a growing sense of strength. This was her chance to make sure that Officer Daniels couldn't hurt anyone else. The defense tried to discredit Tanya's story, but Rachel was ready. She calmly presented more evidence, including statements from witnesses who had been at the store that day. One by one, they confirmed Tanya's account of what had happened. The video footage was played in the courtroom, showing Officer Daniels pushing and kicking Tanya, leaving no room for doubt. The defense had no answers, no way to justify his actions. As the trial continued, the pressure on the police department grew. The public was watching, and the support for Tanya and Marcus only grew stronger. Protests outside the courthouse became larger, with people holding signs that read, "Justice for Tanya," and "Hold officers accountable." It was clear that the community was standing with them, and that made all the difference. Days passed, and the trial reached its final stages. The judge listened carefully, and when it was time for the closing arguments, Rachel spoke passionately. What happened to Tanya was not an isolated incident. She said, her voice steady, "Officer Daniels has a history of misconduct, and the department ignored it. They allowed this man to continue serving as a police officer when they should have taken action long ago. It is time for justice to be served." The judge took some time to deliberate, and Tanya and Marcus waited in tense silence. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as they waited for the decision. Finally, the judge returned to the bench and addressed the room. After reviewing the evidence and hearing the testimony, the judge said, "It is clear that Officer Daniels used excessive force and acted without justification. His actions were inexcusable. He will be terminated from his position, and he will face legal consequences for his behavior." Tanya and Marcus looked at each other, a wave of relief washing over them. It wasn't just a victory for them. It was a victory for everyone who had been mistreated by those who were supposed to protect them. Officer Daniels would face the consequences, and it sent a strong message to others that they couldn't get away with abuse. As the courtroom emptied, Tanya and Marcus walked out into the light, feeling the weight of everything they had been through. It was over, but the fight had changed them. They knew they had made a difference, and they couldn't have done it without the support of their community. In the end, they had not only found justice for Tanya, but had also helped bring attention to a problem that needed to be addressed. Tanya smiled at Marcus, feeling proud of the journey they had taken together. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about standing up for what was right. And they had done just that. The day after the trial, Marcus and Tanya woke up with a mix of emotions. The courtroom battle had ended, but their journey was far from over. The weight of everything they had gone through still hung in the air, but the victory was something they could hold on to. As the news of the verdict spread, messages of support poured in from all over. People congratulated them for their strength and resilience. It was a humbling experience for Tanya, who had never expected her story to touch so many lives. She and Marcus had always just wanted to move on and find peace, but now they realized they had sparked something bigger. The fight for justice wasn't just for them. It was for anyone who had ever been treated unfairly. In the weeks that followed, Tanya and Marcus focused on healing. The physical pain had faded, but the emotional scars lingered. Tanya still had moments when she thought about the officer's actions, about how everything had unfolded so suddenly. But with Marcus by her side, she began to find strength in their shared journey. One evening, as they sat on the couch together, Marcus put his arm around Tanya. "We did it," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "I know it wasn't easy, but we made it through. You're safe, and that's all that matters." Tanya rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his support. "I never thought we'd get this far," she admitted. "It's been so hard, but now, it feels like we finally have some peace. I don't want to think about that officer anymore. I just want to focus on our family." They had so much to look forward to. Tanya's due date was getting closer, and despite everything they had been through, they were excited to welcome their baby into the world. The thought of their child growing up in a world where they had made a small difference gave them hope for the future. But the healing process wasn't just about moving forward. It was also about making sure that what had happened to Tanya never happened again. In the months after the trial, Marcus and Tanya joined local advocacy groups that focused on police reform and community safety. They wanted to make sure the system would change so that others wouldn't have to go through what Tanya had. It was their way of making sure their fight wasn't forgotten. Tanya, though still shaken by the past, felt a new sense of purpose. She became involved in organizing community events and speaking out about the importance of standing up against injustice. She didn't want anyone to feel the way she had felt that day in the store. With Marcus's support, She found the strength to become a voice for those who had been silenced. As time passed, Officer Daniel's actions and the case against him continued to make waves. The police department had to make changes. They were now under increased scrutiny, and there was talk of new policies being implemented to address issues of misconduct. Though it was a slow process, the change was happening. Marcus and Tanya knew they had helped set the wheels of change in motion. Then the moment they had been waiting for finally arrived. Tanya gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby. The joy that filled their home was overwhelming. Marcus held their newborn in his arms, looking at Tanya with tears in his eyes. "We did it," he whispered again, this time with a sense of completion. "We made it through everything, and now we have our future." With their baby in their arms and the world around them changing, Marcus and Tanya knew their fight for justice had been worth it. The road ahead wasn't perfect, but they had each other, and together, they had proven that one voice, one couple, could make a difference. Months had passed since the trial, and things were slowly starting to feel normal again for Marcus and Tanya. Life, though still filled with challenges, had taken a turn toward peace. The case had changed so much in their lives, but now they were focused on their future, one filled with love, growth, and new beginnings. Tanya looked down at her baby, now a few weeks old, cradled gently in her arms. She couldn't stop smiling. The joy that filled her heart every time she looked at her child was something she couldn't put into words. Her baby had become a symbol of hope, not only for their family, but for everyone who had supported them along the way. Marcus was beside her, helping her care for their little one. The small, quiet moments they shared as a family gave them both a sense of calm. The trials they had gone through, the stress, the pain, it all seemed far behind them now. They were ready for what the future had in store. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over their home, Marcus and Tanya took a walk in their neighborhood with the baby in the stroller. It was peaceful, the kind of afternoon they had dreamed of. Tanya smiled as they passed by familiar faces, people who had stood by them throughout the difficult months. It felt good to see them again, knowing they had come through it all together. As they walked, Tanya reflected on everything they had been through. It had been a tough road, but it had also been a journey of self-discovery and growth. She had never imagined that a simple trip to the grocery store would turn into a fight for justice. But now she understood the importance of standing up for what was right. And she had learned that no matter how hard things seemed, there was always a way forward. Marcus, too, felt the weight of their journey lifting. He was proud of the strength Tanya had shown, and he was even prouder of the way they had both handled the pressure. They had come out on top, not because they were perfect, but because they refused to back down. Their story had inspired others, and Marcus knew that it was more than just about them. It was about making a lasting change. But while the victory meant so much, it was the quiet moments like these that mattered the most. Watching their baby grow, seeing the joy in each other's eyes, these were the moments they cherished. The fight for justice had brought them closer together, and now it was time to focus on building their family. As they continued to walk, Tanya's phone buzzed. It was a message from one of the activists they had met during the protests. It was a simple message, one that read, "Your story changed everything. Thank you for your courage." Tanya smiled, showing the message to Marcus. "It feels like we did something important," she said softly. "You did," Marcus replied, his voice full of pride. "We did." The days ahead were uncertain, as they always were, but Tanya and Marcus knew that their family would continue to grow stronger. They had faced adversity and come out the other side with a deeper sense of purpose. They had not only won justice for themselves, but had helped to spark a movement. Now they were ready for the next chapter in their lives, whatever it might bring. As the sun set lower in the sky, the family continued their walk, the sounds of the world around them fading into the background. The future was bright, and they were ready to embrace it together.